You're listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. This is part 2 of our 2-part episode covering Bond County School District 2's decision to improve equity in their district by closing a learning center experiencing declining enrollment. In part 1, we discussed the context behind this decision and what actions the board implemented before voting to close the learning center. If you have not yet listened to part 1, I highly encourage you to do so. In this episode, we will discuss the board's communication efforts around this decision, as well as the importance of a healthy board-superintendent relationship. So, when you're going in to make this announcement, how do you prepare for that?
Well, when we initially were having conversations around drawing boundary lines and reorganization, you saw we had, I think, 5 or 6 different scenarios. So essentially just walking it back, we said, okay, we got to establish boundary lines. We have to equalize these class size and we have to draw lines. And we have to say, if you're on this side of the line, you got to go to that elementary. If you're over here, you have to go to that elementary. And we went through that whole process and created somewhat of a menu of options based on just the natural geography of the district, right? So, each one of those options, depending from an individual lens with families, people were supportive of various different options. And, some of them were pretty, I think some of them are essentially what we do now. But there were also some that were a pretty far reach, I will say, in terms of drawing the line bigger around certain attendance centers to navigate students over there. And so what you saw was, I think, depending on where people lived and what community they were from, kind of advocating for these various positions. And that's where our board meetings, I think, when we started talking about drawing concrete boundary lines, and the board's like, listen, we got to do something about this, right? And that's when the public engagement really took off and the social media really took off. And there were, as Ms. Workman said, it was very divisive. That's a good way to put it.
Well, there are people who buy property, build homes based on where they believe their child will go to school. They make those decisions based on that. And so when you switch that up midstream, people get upset. It's change, and people don't like that kind of change. They worry about the impact, and rightfully so, that it will have on their kids. And we all did. Yeah. We didn't take that decision lightly.
So when we're talking about how this is a really divisive situation, did you see a common reaction from pretty much everyone in the community? Or was the response basically Group A is responding this way and Group B is responding that way?
I would say our 2 smaller attendance centers were definitely feeling very defensive. It didn't help that situation. All of our students attend high school together. And I think maybe even historically, our smaller schools have felt like a little bit of outsiders, but that didn't help that at all. But I really do think that, I always say we're all comets in the end, and I do believe that that's true.
Actually, that was actually like an advantage. Like at the end of the day, they all go to the same high school, right? Yeah. We're talking about where they're going from the time they're pre-K to 8th grade. But generationally, there's still people that were upset that we became a consolidated high school back in 1953, and that the outside communities didn't have their own high schools still, right? I mean, but that's been the evolution of public education for decades now, right? Is that we used to, back in the 19th century, you had the small one-room schoolhouse that everybody walked a mile from. Over the years, school districts have consolidated. They've changed. I mean, it's an ever-evolving thing. It's not anything that anybody else hasn't done. But when it's in your backyard and it's happening to you, it becomes very real. And I think to Randy's point, change is hard. Change is hard for staff. Change is hard for communities. Yeah. And it kind of brings out that fight or flight oftentimes in people. And so what we started to see from a community engagement perspective was very robust discussion at board meetings, particularly in public comment.
We did not engage in back and forth during public comment. I don't know that it would have been productive to do so. I think it may have just led to a lot of arguing. And and we really needed less arguing. And so we didn't engage. We just listened throughout a series of hearings. Oftentimes at the next hearing, Dr. Olsen would address some of the issues brought up at the prior hearing. And so all of those comments were heard and taken into consideration, but we did not engage in a lot of back and forth. Those meetings, we had police officers at those meetings. They're very passionate. And I think that a lot of people stayed out of that situation. A lot of people don't like that kind of confrontation. Makes them very uneasy. And so you do tend to hear from one voice. And then maybe you go home that night and you receive a few emails or a phone call from some other voices who want to be heard, but they're afraid to enter into that kind of environment because it's just too much for them. And that's understandable.
Yeah, right. And public comment isn't the only way you can have community engagement. Some people just simply aren't comfortable sharing their opinions in that setting. I mean, they might have really good points to make, but maybe they're not willing to put themselves in front of the rest of their community and potentially risk saying something that's to them like a bit of a hot take on the topic.
Yeah. So the pre-COVID discussions that went on there, we had a series of town halls. We did one in each community. I would present as superintendent, hey, this is where we're at. Here's the numbers. Here's the enrollment. Here's the decline. Here's what we're looking at. Here are the issues that we need to help solving these problems. And then we would open it up for Q&A. And we had people, recording the questions so we could kind of, come back at some point with an FAQ or whatever. We were trying to be responsive. Unfortunately, what happened really was people weren't trying to seek information. They oftentimes were just trying to, some people were, but a large majority, like we said, of the loud voices were just posturing, just don't do this, you can't do this, and here's why. And so I don't know. Those are important parts of this process, and I would encourage other boards to do that, despite how uncomfortable that is. But it was part of the process. And then COVID happened, and we had all kinds of different public meetings and town halls that people commented, kind of shifted things. So the second time around, to your point about elevating other voices and not just listening to the loud voices in the room, we still had a very similar format. I would provide the information. This time there was often press there. We're close enough to St. Louis that there was a pretty significant St. Louis media presence there. We were on the Channel 9 News oftentimes after those. But we leveraged a platform. And I won't say the specific platform because I don't want to feel like I'm doing an advertisement here, but we partnered with a tech platform that did crowdsourcing. And so we could post questions. We could put it in like a survey interactive format where, to Ms. Workman's point, some of those folks that didn't want to be around the loud meetings could get their voice to the table. And so that was a strategic approach that we talked about afterwards. Like, hey, we don't know how productive those previous meetings were. It would probably get more of the same. What's a way that we can get more voices to the table so that the loud voices aren't seen as the only voice? And so I thought that was a game changer for us, at least from my perspective, in terms of getting data and public feedback from people. And so I would encourage any board to look at that type of partnership or option, because the reality is that there was a silent majority that was saying, listen, we want what's best for kids, and there's an economic taxpayer component there and fiscal responsibility component. You heard a lot more voices than what you heard when we just had the town halls. And
as a board member, that was really helpful to know that you're on the right track, that you're not just out there on an island doing something that your community overall doesn't support. Most of the decisions you make, 50% of the people might not like them. And so that going into every decision, but a big decision like this, you really needed to hear from everyone.
Yeah. And I want to go back in time just a little bit, because I think this is important, particularly for board members who may be listening or superintendents. the whole discussion also came out of community engagement that we did years ago around strategic planning and visioning for our district. So we had facilitators and we did town halls back then on not just enrollment, but we were doing a 5-year strategic plan, a mission, vision. What are our goals for the next 5 years? And class size equity was one of those. It came up during that time. So it wasn't like something that we just threw on the table. I mean, we had done the strategic planning process. Of course, there's all kinds of other things that come out of that facility. People wanted better facilities. They wanted fiscal responsibility. They wanted all these different things. But that process in and of itself, going back now 7 years ago, 6 years ago, really laid the groundwork for doing some of this work. Because then we'd point to the district's strategic plan. We would say, listen, this isn't just the superintendent throwing this on the table. Here's the strategic plan. We can go back 5 years when we engaged with the community, and they said equity and class size is important in our district. And so had we not done that kind of front loaded work or the pre-work in the strategic planning, I think it would have gone even more awry potentially.
I agree.
I would say any new superintendent going into a district, or if a district is feeling, just like, hey, we need some more direction here, I would say, just engaging in an overall strategic planning process that engages the community, brings their voices to the table. It lays the groundwork for making hard decisions later, because you point back to it, right? And you say, this is what we all agreed on. I mean, we've talked about this extensively. Everybody had an opportunity to be involved in it, and here's what it looked like. And that's one of the components that came up of the issues that we needed to solve problems around. So it's hard kind of thinking back to this. I forget that piece, but that's a really important component. It was
valuable directive from the community.
So, I mean, you've got a lot of moving parts with this. And on top of all this, you have media coverage and police presence at board meetings. I mean, how do you not get completely overwhelmed at, each board meeting or even every work day? Like, how do you keep moving ahead and reminding yourself that you're making the right decision and not feeling like the entire world's kind of like collapsing in on you?
I would say that historically, I believe other boards in our district did talk about this issue. And there are a lot of things that happened. Fortunately, we had some pretty resilient board members who stayed true to the task and had a true belief that it would serve the future of our district for the better. And so they stuck it out. And there were times when I think everyone wanted to throw in the towel. We all have families. We all live in this community. I would think it's safe to say we all lost friends over this decision. But uniquely, we had board members who really felt strongly that it was the right thing to do for the long term. And so they stuck it out. And we had a superintendent. I think that's important to note. You are asking a superintendent to potentially put his job on the line when you start a process like this. You could have a community turn on a superintendent really quickly. And finding someone or having someone that's willing to tackle those tough issues is tough. And I would tell any superintendent, this is going to be really hard from a career standpoint. For all of us, we're board members. We all have other careers. For your superintendent, it is their career. That's really important to note. And it's a tough decision to make. You have to have a superintendent that believes in public education and equity and is willing, like the board members, to tackle that at all costs. And I think that's an important component. The board members make the vote, but you have to be working in tandem with a superintendent who's willing to take something like that on.
There has to be, from my perspective as superintendent, there has to be a level of trust with the board, which we can talk about those dynamics. I mean, it was a pretty wild ride, but just like anything else as a superintendent dealing with tough issues, it's important to have a network of folks you can rely on, colleagues that you can call and say, hey, I just need to talk to somebody about this. And I think one of the things that has come out of COVID and that whole scenario for our kids, for our faculty, for leadership. I mean, for the first time in a long time at the superintendent through IASA and through various groups, we're talking about self-care, not just as a placeholder, but truly talking about wellness and mental health and, not destroying yourself to do the job.
Yes.
And that's not where we were 10 years ago at all. I mean, you had to just button up and straighten your tie and get back at it. And there wasn't this component of kind of humanizing the role. And so and fortunately, we've also seen this trickle down to our students, right? Like we've post-COVID really focused on social emotional wellness and supporting our students' mental health more than we ever have before. And I think that that's one of the bright shining spots that has come out of the pandemic, right? Is that it's okay to talk about it. And it's absolutely imperative as a district that we allocate resources towards that. For example, that was one of the underlying. So the second time round 2, as we call it, the second time we talked about this, because there was a vote at one point in time, the board voted not to close the school. They said, we're not going to do that. As I said, then the pandemic happened, and there was a sense of urgency about our kids need support, mental health support. We need to hire professional specialists to help these students. And so when we talked about closing a facility, we talked about it from the lens of a reallocation of resources. Our students' needs have changed. Therefore, how we allocate our resources as a district also has to change, right? And so, like I talked about before, early childhood reading and there was two paths. One was academic, the other was social emotional. I mean, we talked about that. Like, hey, if we close this school, this is how we're going to use those resources. We're going to hire more counselors. We're going to hire more social workers. We're going to throw everything we can at supporting these students who have just been through a very traumatic and historical experience. And so I think, at least in my mind, that made sense, right? And that it wasn't just about competing communities and tribalism and all that kind of stuff. It really was bringing the conversation back to, we have kids that need help, and we can't do it the way we need to do it in our old format. We have to change in order to better support these kids. And there were people that argued against that, but I think it's a foolhardy stance to take. And so at the end of the day, our conversation kept coming back to that. How can we better support kids? And the social emotional piece was a component of it. So, I mean, we all felt that, right? During the pandemic, everybody. Oh, yeah. And so I think that, that's a defendable position when you're talking about students' social emotional well-being, that we allocate resources to that. Yeah, maybe we've never done that before, but guess what? It's time to do it now.
And to be clear, this was a couple of month process. Oh, yeah. So you're staying in this environment for a significant period of time. I can't speak to how other board members dealt with it, but I know specifically as board president, there were times when I thought, you know what, I'm not going to reach out to any board members this week. We all need a break. Let's take a break. I encouraged people to clock out. Don't answer your phone. Don't look at your email. Spend some time with your family. Take a trip. Do something to ease your mind. And it's important, you mentioned colleagues. There were several times that I was ready to just throw in the towel. And some former teachers reached out to me with support, former board members, other community leaders who had been in the middle of hard decisions that reached out personally to support me during that time. And that was the difference maker for me, to have their insight. They had done things like this before, and to have them say, you've got this, you're going to be okay. This is the right thing. Keep going. That really helped me personally. How the other board members handled it, I wouldn't want to say. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, but for me, that's what got me through.
I think it's great that you brought up the social emotional learning component of this as well, because like from the layman's perspective, I think it can be easy to kind of point at this decision and say, well, this decision just to save a buck, when really it's more about coming to an equitable solution for our students, because it means closing a facility, and yes, costs are coming down because of that, but you're not pocketing the excess. It's being reinvested back into the student body, back into the social emotional needs of students, so that they have a better chance at success as opposed to being isolated from their peers.
Absolutely. We did not lead with the financial impact. Mm-hmm. Like, obviously there's a benefit to the district when you aren't operating a whole facility, but that was absolutely not the main rationale or what we led with. It was about serving kids.
Yeah, I think that would probably lend itself to the success of this outcome of the decision, because it paints a different picture of the reasoning behind the decision that's not monetary. Like, some people might go into a board meeting already assuming that they know exactly the reason why this decision is being made, but they maybe haven't considered the other non-monetary reasons behind this decision. So I think it really does position your case for doing this much higher than I think one might generally assumed.
It's safe to say, that decision had an impact on students. Students relocated. There will be a side of this that says they weren't thinking about our kids. Our kids had to move schools. That wasn't easy. And the reality is, not just in school closure, every decision that we make has an impact on kids. Most of our financial decisions and limitations. And when you're talking about cutting programs, this isn't the only decision that you make that has an impact on certain sections of kids that's less than desirable. That's the hardest part about doing this job. That's the hardest part about voting, when you know you're making those decisions that might be hard for students.
Yeah.
And you have to do it anyway.
So what factors would you contribute to the success of the outcome of this decision? I guess we've kind of skipped ahead a little bit to the end, but the district did end up going forward with the decision to close the Learning Center. So what has been the outcome of that?
So that was in, I believe, the spring of 22. We started those kind of round two, as I said, of town halls in December of 21. And then we ended up, the board ended up voting to close the facility, I believe in February, maybe of 22. And so then you have, you go right into the planning and transition, and, there was a certain sense of loss, I think. There's a kind of a healing, I won't say healing period, but a mourning period, and certainly try to be sensitive to that and provide emotional support, and really just provide a picture of, hey, this is what it's going to look like, and affirm that there's a plan, and that, we're going to come to school next year and it's going to look different, but here's how we're going to make that work and then execute it.
I agree with that. It was a process. We had a lot of things to figure out, right? Post-decision, there were a lot of things to figure out. Transportation. What does this look like, moving these students? How do we divide these students among attendance centers? And we really did try to, and the district worked really hard to allow students to attend the center that they wanted to attend. We tried as hard as we could to accommodate allowing students to be at the center where they chose to go to school, to try to make that transition a little bit easier, maybe for mom or dad's work schedule. Maybe they had family members they were familiar with. But I think we did accommodate nearly every student as to where they wanted to go to school.
A majority, yeah. And then there was a period, where we did that for, I believe, 2 years, where there was still a form of open enrollment that families could request. It was at the approval of the superintendent. And then we have since grandfathered that. So students are where they're at, right? We're not doing this every year. So we had that open enrollment period. Hey, this is where they're at. And then here are the lines. If there's new students coming in, this is what the boundary map looks like. Yeah. And we review that annually. Not that we kind of dig at that wound, but we look at enrollment and we say, hey, are these boundary lines appropriate? It's something that you continue to follow up on. Fortunately, they haven't moved. They've been fine. And we anticipate they will continue to be, in terms of enrollment and class size, operating in the manner that we are now for some time.
And the experience is similar for all of our students, the class, and our teachers. That's important to note again. Everyone is teaching very closely similar amount of students. Every student is in a similar environment. Mm-hmm. No matter where you're from in our district, you're having, and there are a lot of things that have been done. There's been a lot of curriculum work to make sure that across the district, the curriculum is the same, that everything is happening the same, and all of our centers as close as we can. Now, teachers teach things differently, and you're always going to have a little bit of difference there, but I think it's important to provide that experience for every student. And I feel like we're doing that now.
Good.
I'm proud of what we're doing. I'm proud of the way the kids have adjusted. We have students that are doing very well and are thriving in their new environment. And I don't want to speak for their families because that would be inappropriate, but I am really proud of the way our students have adjusted to the change and our staff has adjusted to the change. At the end of the day, I mean, we're 2 years past that decision, and I think there has been some healing, as you might want to say, in our district since then. At least I hope so.
Yeah, and this is all awesome. I mean, it sounds like the outcome has solved the original issue in addressing the enrollment and the inequity that was occurring in the district. So looking back on this experience, would you have done anything differently?
We've talked about that a lot. I think that every district that looks at this kind of decision and goes through this process is going to have a similar but different experience. Your communities are going to respond differently. Your board members are going to respond differently depending on the climate of your board. And your superintendent. I hate to even say what we did well or what I think could have been different, because I think that's really specific to everyone that might be doing it. What I would say is that as a board member, and we see this a lot now, if you're getting on a board for a particular cause because you have a bone to pick with something that's happening in your district, do the hard work. Be there to do the hard work. Mm-hmm. Make the decisions that benefit your district long into the future. Have vision for where your district needs to go. And be willing to tackle the things that matter to kids, like equity, learning loss. Those are the things that matter. Try to stay out of the weeds of all the really dramatic things that are happening that are divisive in public education right now. And I think every board member in the state experiences a level of that. Mm-hmm. But don't pursue a board position because of those things. Pursue that position to serve your community and to serve your students.
Absolutely.
And know that no matter what you do, and if you check every box that says this is exactly what this should look like, there's going to be an element of chaos that you're going to have to survive.
That's a really good point. I would just add to that and say that I think, I don't know if I'd change anything, but I could say that I think where we did it right was focusing on data and focusing on serving all kids. And if you do those two things, you're going to be in the general right direction, I think. Because it elevates the conversation above pure emotion. And so that's very important. From a superintendent's perspective, I would say that I would never undertake this unless that you have a support of the majority of the board to do it. I would say that you probably need to talk with your attorney and not do it in like the last year of your contract, but maybe have a contract that gets you to the end and a couple of years beyond. And I would say not to take it personally. You've already made that point, but it's easy to say that. But when you're in the midst of it and it's affecting your family and your children and those that love you, it's tough not to want to fight that. You know what I mean? And so you really have to just take the high road professionally and not get in the mud, for lack of a better term.
You have to remember, no matter who is sitting at that table, making that kind of decision, they would be under scrutiny. It's not just that it's you sitting there. It's anyone who is sitting at that table, and anyone who is serving on any board right now, I think understands that. We've been through some tough things across the state. Everyone knows that there are some horror stories out there, but I like to keep the focus on what we're doing that's right, and just kind of let the noise be under the radar as far as our goals for the district.
And if there was any value to round one of this, is that it happened pre-COVID. So when COVID came around and things got elevated and community engagement was very active and at times very adversarial, it was, I would commend this board because they had already been through a really divisive issue. So it was like, okay, well, here's another thing that we're addressing. But I think for some boards, COVID was the first time that they've seen that type of reaction. For our district, we had already kind of done it the first time that we were talking about closing a school got put on the table. So that's a lot in a short amount of time, but I mean, you get seasoned and you ultimately know that, hey, the work we do is really important and it is about kids. I mean, you always have to bring it back to doing the best you can with what you have for the most number of kids that you can in your district. That's what it's about.
I mean, avoiding conflict is not an excuse to not deal with issues. It's just not. And so I hope that COVID and the experience that many board members had during COVID has not kept boards from moving forward with hard work and doing the right things in their district, because I think everyone suffered during that time, had a lot of stress during that time. A lot of people don't want to revisit that. But the truth is we have a lot of work to do. And we need to keep doing it.
They say that hindsight's 20/20, but I think it's really telling that even looking back, you wouldn't change anything. So I think that really speaks to the strength of your board's relationship with the superintendent and the importance of being on the same page and for the same goal, and not having a full board of members who are maybe only out there for only one specific reason or one specific issue. Everyone's working together as a group collectively.
You have to have a majority that view it like that. Yes. There's always going to be outliers. Sure. And there's always going to be people that do their own thing. Mm-hmm. But for the majority of the board is saying, hey, this is the right thing, then you're in a good spot. Is
there anything additional that you'd like to share with school leaders who might be facing a similar situation in their district in the near future?
I would say reach out to us anytime. We're willing to talk to anyone about it and share insights and just stay focused on the task at hand.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm happy to help anybody that needs it about anything, really. I mean, we're in this together. I think that's one of the very gratifying things about being in the superintendency that I've seen over the years is that it's a tight-knit group and that there's a lot of support there for each other. And I believe in that and receiving. I've been the recipient of it, and I absolutely believe in helping anyone that I can when I can.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Olsen and Ms. Workman, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your district experience with us. It sounds like it was a really difficult decision to make and one that needs a lot of thought and a lot of time to execute properly. So I'm glad that your board was able to persevere and make the right decision that they felt was best for your community and for equity. And thank you for encouraging other members to reach out to you if they have any additional questions. So again, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you'd like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube Music. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to leave us a voicemail via the link in the description or send us a voicemail at communications@iasb.com. Thanks.